What do you make of this? As far as we know what's going on, how significant are these developments?
I think it's quite significant that you have this kind of territory being regained by the Ukrainians in a very short period of time. They've almost doubled overnight the territory they cede. So this says something a lot about the Russians. Number one, they are not 10 feet tall. They are poorly trained, equipped, led, and fed. All of those things are being reflected in the way they were routed. And they didn't retreat, they didn't regroup, they had a route, they were routed. And so I think it says a lot about the quality of the Russian military, where they are right now. It says a lot more about the Ukrainians, because the Ukrainians are now fired up. They have said to us, you give us the means and we'll provide the muscle. What we need is more equipment that we can more easily target the Russians, that we can shoot and scoot, so to speak, in terms of the mobility of the HIMARS and other equipment. So they're asking for more equipment, number one. They're asking for more help on the resettlement of refugees, or helping people to stay in Ukraine, because the longer the refugees stay in Poland and other countries, the harder it's going to be for them to go back. So they need short-term help on the refugees, and they need short-term help on reconstruction to make sure they have power, light, food, water, all the things that are being attacked by Putin at this point.
So, Mr. Secretary, you've had extensive experience with Russia and before that the Soviet Union. You've observed President Putin for a good long time. My impression is he does not like to back down. So what should we be prepared to anticipate, at least, about his response? Because thus far, he's not saying he's going to take his marbles and go home.
Well, I don't think he's headed for the island of Elba, as Napoleon did, or exiled there. I think he's not going to go gently into that good night. The future doesn't look really bright for him, in the sense if he continues to suffer this kind of loss, whether the Russian people will eventually turn against him. There's now talk that he may start a draft and have a call up of forces. Perhaps he can do that in the short term. People saying, well, it's really now a war and not a special mission. That could have its own dynamic to undermine him at home. On the other hand, it could say that now we've got a bigger fighting force. They won't be well trained and well led in the short term, but in the long term, Russia's still big. It's a big, strong country in terms of its oil, in terms of its guns and military equipment. And so I suspect that Putin is going to continue to make a long-term campaign to see if he can't just continue to attrit the forces in Ukraine, because they have so many more people to overwhelm them. And that's what I expect he'll try and do. I think he'll also continue to commit war crimes. He has committed multiple war crimes. Number one, by invading a neutral country. Number two, by attacking civilians and slaughtering them. And I think now going after their food supplies, electricity, and power. That's another war crime being waged by him. And now we're worried, not worried, we're concerned, I should say, that he may go even further. This was true when the campaign initially was foiled, when they didn't take Kyiv. Would he use tactical nuclear weapons? Would he use chemical weapons? I think the Western world has to get together now and not wait, and say, if he does this, these are the things that we're prepared to do. We cannot let this go and say it's just another form of fighting. Chemical weapons have been outlawed for decades now. Nuclear weapons not allowed to be used on the battlefield. If he does any of these, we have to have a plan. The world has to have a plan to say, if you do this, these are the consequences. And I wouldn't be anxious to spell them out, but I would be prepared to invoke them immediately and be a devastating impact upon Russia itself. It doesn't have to be military, but it certainly has to be consequential.
You mentioned, Mr. Secretary, HIMARS and other weaponry, advanced weaponry we've been providing, NATO as well as the United States, to the Ukrainians. Is this a time, given the success, we should reconsider the fixed-wing aircraft issue?
I think it's always time to think about that. In the beginning, we were worried that if we provided that kind of equipment and capability, that would set Putin and set him off on an even more aggressive attack upon Ukraine. I think the more he engages in what is clearly heinous activity, then it's more likely that other countries, including the United States, would be more willing to provide that kind of equipment and capability to Ukrainians. We've seen when we give them what they need, they're able to hold their own. They're able to inflict substantial damage upon the Russians, even though they're heavily outnumbered. In my own way of thinking of it, you could take a well-trained, well-muscled middleweight is going up against an obese heavyweight. Can the middleweight hold his own under those circumstances? If you give him that muscle in terms of the equipment, then they're holding their own. So I think we have to give them whatever they need and try not to cross a line that's going to set in motion a counterattack that will be simply designed to destroy Ukraine. Make a desert and call it peace. He's capable of that. And that's why the Western world has to be willing to stand up and say, these are unacceptable. You started a war, you're losing the war. It's up to you now to find a road and a pathway off. But we're not going to tolerate anyone using chemical, biological, or nuclear weapons.
Finally, Mr. Secretary, to put it in a somewhat broader context, we have tomorrow President Xi of China meeting with President Putin in Uzbekistan, apparently to redouble their friendship and their commitment to one another. How important is that to us, the United States, and to Ukraine and to NATO?
Well, I think it's very important. I think over the years, we tried to make sure that we didn't push Russia into the arms of the Chinese. They have been moving in that direction ever since we've been moving away from certainly from Russia, but also from China. A number of us have been trying to see, is there any way we can look to China, which is second biggest economy in the world? They are a military power. I would put them in the not near peer, I'd put them in the peer competitor category in terms of what they've invested in their military. So are there areas that we can either cooperate, collaborate, or confront if we have to? But I would want to explore can we do together? Can we do something together on food security, energy security, pandemic cooperation, the health needs of the Chinese people and the United States? Those are areas we can continue to work with them. Or the other choice would be we're just going to disengage. We're going to decouple our economies. And I don't think that's a good idea. But I think it's worth us pursuing. I think that President Biden is going to try to pursue those areas that we feel we can cooperate and collaborate rather than simply say, you're an adversary and we're going to confront you on each and every issue and may the best country win. I don't think that's something we want to do. I don't think we'll have allies in the Indo-Pacific region that will support that. They want us to be a force in the region. They don't want us to try to force them to make a choice. Do they deal with China as a friend or the United States? They look to the United States as a friend, but they don't want us to start action that's going to put them in a position of having to choose. They're in the neighborhood, we are not, and that's something that's always of concern on their part.